Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to share with you today might be one of the most consequential moments in modern geopolitical history. A speech was delivered that has sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels across the globe, from Ottawa to Copenhagen, from Brussels to Moscow. When a sitting president takes the stage at the World Economic Forum in Davos and makes declarations that challenge the very foundations of international alliances, territorial sovereignty, and diplomatic norms, the world stops and listens. And believe me, what was said in that room will be analyzed, debated, and referenced for years to come. The relationship between the United States and its closest allies may never be the same after what transpired on that stage. So sit tight, because what I am about to break down for you is nothing short of extraordinary, and the implications are far-reaching in ways that many are only beginning to understand. I have covered countless political speeches throughout my career, but rarely have I witnessed a moment where so many different threads of international policy were woven together in such a dramatic fashion. President Donald Trump, speaking to an audience of world leaders, business executives, and global influencers in Davos, Switzerland, delivered remarks that touched on everything from NATO funding to territorial ambitions, from military expansion to direct warnings aimed at allied nations. The speech was vintage Trump in many ways, combining his characteristic bluntness with sweeping claims about American power and influence. But there was something different this time, something that felt more definitive, more consequential. The president was not merely making suggestions or floating ideas. He was laying down markers, establishing positions, and issuing what many interpreted as direct challenges to nations that have long considered themselves trusted partners of the United States. Let me take you through what happened, because the details matter immensely in understanding the full scope of what was communicated to the world. The president began by addressing NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that has served as the cornerstone of Western security since its founding in 1949. He made it abundantly clear that, in his view, the relationship between the United States and European NATO members has been fundamentally imbalanced for far too long. According to the president, before he came into office, European nations were not meeting their financial obligations to the alliance. The original commitment was for member nations to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense, a target that many countries consistently failed to meet for years. Trump claimed that under previous administrations, the United States was essentially footing the bill for the entire alliance, covering what he described as virtually 100% of NATO's costs, while European nations enjoyed protection without paying their fair share. Now, here's where things get particularly interesting, and where the president's claims become a subject of significant debate among policy experts and fact-checkers. Trump stated that he not only got NATO members to pay the 2% they had originally committed to, but that he pushed them to agree to 5% of GDP for defense spending. This is a remarkable claim, and one that has raised eyebrows in diplomatic circles. The president suggested that this achievement was something nobody thought possible, that experts and analysts had written off any increase beyond 2% as unrealistic. Yet, according to him, the 5% target is now being met. He praised the current NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who was present in the audience, acknowledging his role in the organization, while simultaneously emphasizing that the United States has historically asked for nothing in return for its protection of Europe. This framing sets up what would become the central tension of the speech: the idea that America has given much and received little, and that this imbalance is about to change in dramatic fashion. The stage was set for what came next, and believe me, what followed would make headlines around the world for reasons that go far beyond NATO funding discussions. As I continued watching this speech unfold, I realized that President Trump was building towards something much bigger than a discussion about defense budgets. The NATO remarks were merely the opening act, the foundation upon which he would construct an argument for a dramatic shift in American foreign policy priorities. And then came the moment that truly captured global attention, when the president turned his focus to a massive island territory that most people rarely think about in geopolitical terms. I am talking, of course, about Greenland, the world's largest island, an autonomous territory of Denmark that has suddenly become the center of one of the most unusual diplomatic controversies in recent memory. What the president said about Greenland was not a passing comment or a speculative musing. It was a clear and unambiguous statement of intent that has left Danish officials scrambling to respond and international observers questioning what it all means for the rules-based international order. The president declared that all the United States is asking for is a place called Greenland. And he framed this request in historical terms that many historians would certainly dispute. According to Trump, the United States previously held Greenland as a trustee and respectfully returned it to Denmark after World War II, following the Allied victory over Germany, Japan, Italy, and the Axis powers. He characterized this return as an act of American generosity, suggesting that the United States, as a powerful force at that time, chose to give back territory it could have kept. Now, the president argued, America is an even more powerful force, and the time has come to revisit this arrangement. He emphasized that the United States is not seeking a lease or a licensing agreement for Greenland. Rather, the president explicitly stated that America wants right, title, and ownership of the territory. This is an extraordinary demand by any measure, one that challenges fundamental principles of international law regarding territorial sovereignty and the rights of nations to maintain control over their own territory. The reasoning the president offered for this demand centered on national security and the strategic importance of Greenland's location. Trump argued that you cannot properly defend territory under a lease arrangement, citing both legal and psychological factors. From a legal standpoint, he suggested that defending leased territory is not fully defensible, though the specifics of this argument remain unclear. From a psychological perspective, he asked rhetorically who would want to defend a license agreement or a lease, implying that American military personnel and the broader public would be more motivated to protect territory that actually belongs to the United States. He painted a vivid picture of potential future conflict, describing Greenland as a large piece of ice in the middle of the ocean that would be central to any major military confrontation. In his words, if there is a war, much of the action will take place on that piece of ice, with missiles flying right over its center. This framing positions Greenland not as a distant Arctic territory of marginal importance, but as a critical strategic asset that the United States cannot afford to leave in the hands of another nation, even an allied one. What makes this demand particularly striking is the implied threat that accompanied it. The president stated that the United States has never asked for anything from NATO allies and has never received anything, but then added a caveat that sent a chill through diplomatic circles. He said that America probably will not get anything unless he decides to use excessive strength and force, where the United States would be, in his words, frankly, unstoppable. Now, I want to be very clear about what happened next because it is crucial to understanding the full context of these remarks. After making this statement about potential force, Trump immediately walked it back, saying he would not use force, he does not want to use force, and he will not use force. He even acknowledged the relief in the room, noting that everyone was saying good and calling it probably the biggest statement he made because people thought he might actually use force. But the fact that such a statement was made at all, even with the immediate reversal, represents a remarkable moment in diplomatic discourse between allied nations. Now, as I process what I have just described to you, I need to shift focus to another element of the president's speech that has generated enormous controversy, particularly north of the American border. You see, Greenland was not the only territory on President Trump's mind during these remarks. The president also turned his attention to Canada, and the message he delivered to America's northern neighbor was nothing short of astonishing in its directness and its dismissive tone toward a nation that has been one of the United States' closest allies for well over a century. The relationship between the United States and Canada has always been characterized as special, a partnership between two nations that share the world's longest undefended border, extensive trade relationships, and deep cultural and historical ties. What the president said in Davos challenges the very foundation of that relationship and has prompted a fierce response from Canadian leadership. The context for the president's remarks about Canada centered on his plans for what he called the greatest golden dome ever built, a reference to an advanced missile defense system that he envisions protecting North America from potential adversaries. Trump explained that this dome, similar in concept to the Iron Dome system that protects Israel from rocket attacks, would by its very nature provide protection for Canada as well as the United States. He framed this as Canada receiving freebies from America, benefits that flow naturally from American investment and American technology without Canada having to contribute proportionally. The president was explicit in his view that Canada should be grateful for this protection, but in his assessment, Canadians are not showing the gratitude he believes they should. He referenced watching the Canadian Prime Minister the previous day and concluded that the Prime Minister was not so grateful in his public statements. This sets up a dynamic where the president expects deference and appreciation from allied nations in exchange for the security umbrella that American military power provides. But the president did not stop at suggesting that Canada should simply be more thankful. His statement went further into territory that many observers found shocking in its implications. Trump declared that Canada lives because of the United States, and he directed this comment specifically at Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, telling him to remember that the next time he makes statements. This characterization of Canada as a nation whose very existence depends on American goodwill represents a fundamental reframing of the relationship between these two countries. It suggests not a partnership of equals or even a relationship between a larger and smaller ally, but rather a dynamic in which Canada's sovereignty and continued existence as an independent nation is contingent upon American sufferance. This is an extraordinary claim to make about any nation, but particularly about Canada, which has its own proud history, its own military capabilities, and its own role in international affairs that extends far beyond its relationship with the United States. The response from Canada has been swift and pointed. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who assumed office recently in a historic election that many saw as a direct response to American pressure and trade policies, has pushed back forcefully against what many Canadians perceive as bullying and disrespect from their southern neighbor. The headline that has emerged from this exchange captures the essence of the confrontation: Trump threatening Canada's Prime Minister with consequences if gratitude is not forthcoming. This represents a dramatic escalation in tensions between two nations that have historically resolved their differences through quiet diplomacy rather than public confrontation. The fact that the president chose to make these statements on a global stage in front of world leaders and international media, rather than through private diplomatic channels, signals a new approach to the relationship that many in Canada find deeply troubling. The question now is how this relationship will evolve going forward, and whether the traditional bonds between these two nations can withstand this kind of public pressure. I want to take a moment now to discuss the military dimensions of the president's speech, because woven throughout his remarks about NATO, Greenland, and Canada were references to American military power that deserve careful examination. President Trump has long emphasized his commitment to rebuilding and expanding the United States military, and his comments in Davos reinforce this priority in vivid terms. He referenced the current defense budget of $1.5 trillion, a staggering sum that dwarfs the military spending of any other nation on Earth. But beyond the budget numbers, the president made specific claims about military capabilities that caught the attention of defense analysts and military observers around the world. These claims, if accurate, would represent a significant evolution in American naval power and strategic capabilities. The president announced that the United States is bringing back battleships, and he described these new vessels in terms that border on the superlative. According to Trump, each of these new battleships is 100 times more powerful than the great battleships of World War II, ships like the Missouri, the Iowa, and the Alabama that have become iconic symbols of American naval might. He described those historic vessels as gorgeous ships, as magnificent pieces of art that people still see on television and marvel at. The president shared an anecdote about initially considering whether the old battleships could be taken out of mothballs and returned to service. But he said he was told that the new ships are so vastly more powerful that refurbishing the old vessels made no sense. 100 times more powerful is an extraordinary claim, and while the specific metrics behind this comparison are not entirely clear, the message the president intended to convey is unmistakable. The United States possesses military capabilities that far exceed anything the world has seen before, and these capabilities continue to grow under his leadership. This emphasis on military power serves a clear rhetorical purpose in the context of the president's broader argument. When he discusses territorial ambitions regarding Greenland, when he suggests that the United States could use excessive strength and force if necessary, and when he tells Canada that it lives because of America, these statements carry additional weight when paired with descriptions of overwhelming military capability. The president is not merely making political arguments, he is backing those arguments with implicit references to hard power that his audience cannot ignore. Whether or not the United States would actually use military force against allied nations like Denmark or Canada is beside the point in some ways. The mere suggestion that such force exists and could theoretically be deployed changes the nature of the conversation and the calculations that other nations must make when responding to American demands. The reference to the Golden Dome defense system adds another layer to this military narrative. The president compared his plans for continental missile defense to the Iron Dome system that has proven highly effective in protecting Israel from rocket attacks launched by hostile forces. He even took a moment to address Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu directly, telling him to stop taking credit for the dome because it is American technology. This comment reinforces the theme of American technological superiority, while also suggesting that even close allies like Israel should acknowledge their dependence on American innovation and support. The Golden Dome project, as described by the president, would represent one of the most ambitious missile defense undertakings in history, designed to protect not just the United States, but the entire North American continent from potential attacks. The president framed this as something that would benefit Canada, whether Canadians acknowledge it or not, further supporting his argument that nations in America's security orbit should demonstrate gratitude for protection they receive without having to ask or pay for it directly. As I bring this analysis to a close, I want to reflect on the broader implications of what we witnessed in Davos and what it means for the international order going forward. The speech delivered by President Trump was not a one-off moment of rhetorical excess. It represented a clear articulation of how the current administration views America's role in the world and its relationships with nations that have historically been considered partners and allies. The message that emerged from these remarks is one of transactional relationships, where American protection and support come with expectations of reciprocity that go far beyond traditional alliance frameworks. Nations that benefit from American power, whether through NATO membership, geographic proximity, or technological cooperation, are being put on notice that the terms of these arrangements are subject to renegotiation, and that American patience with what the president perceives as free riding has reached its limit. The specific demands regarding Greenland raise profound questions about the stability of the international system. The principle that nations cannot simply demand territorial concessions from other sovereign states has been a cornerstone of the post-World War II order. Even when major powers have desired territory held by others, the general norm has been to pursue such interests through negotiation, purchase, or other peaceful means that respect the sovereign rights of the current owner to refuse. The president's comments, while ultimately stating that force will not be used, nonetheless introduce the possibility of force into a conversation between allied democracies in a way that has not been seen in decades. Danish officials have made clear that Greenland is not for sale, and the Greenlandic population, while small, has its own views on its political future that do not necessarily align with American desires. How this situation resolves itself will have implications far beyond the Arctic, as other nations watch to see whether American pressure can achieve results that would reshape maps and territorial boundaries. The treatment of Canada in the president's remarks has already had tangible political consequences that may reshape North American politics for years to come. The recent Canadian election, which brought Prime Minister Mark Carney to power, was widely seen as a referendum on how Canada should respond to American pressure during the Trump administration. Carney, a former central banker with extensive international experience, campaigned on a platform of defending Canadian sovereignty and dignity while maintaining productive relations with the United States where possible. The president's dismissive comments about Canada, his suggestion that Canada exists only because of American tolerance, and his demands for gratitude have inflamed nationalist sentiment north of the border and made it politically difficult for any Canadian leader to appear accommodating toward American demands. The relationship between these two nations, which handle more bilateral trade than almost any other country pair in the world, faces a period of uncertainty and tension that could have real economic consequences for citizens on both sides of the border. What happens next is the question that everyone is asking, and I wish I could provide a definitive answer. The speech in Davos has opened multiple fronts of diplomatic controversy that will need to be addressed in the coming weeks and months. NATO allies are processing the claim that they have agreed to 5% defense spending and determining how to respond to a characterization of alliance history that many dispute. Denmark and Greenland are formulating their position on American territorial demands that they have already rejected, but that clearly have not gone away. Canada is navigating a relationship with its largest trading partner and neighbor that has become openly hostile in ways that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years ago. And the broader international community is watching all of this unfold, drawing conclusions about what American power means in the current era and what constraints, if any, exist on its exercise. These are consequential times, and the decisions made in response to what we heard in Davos will shape the geopolitical landscape for years to come. I will continue to monitor these developments and bring you updates as this story evolves. Thank you for joining me for this important analysis of a speech that may well be remembered as a turning point in international relations.